They stepped through the doors of the mess hall and burst into laughter. The Americans had arranged a cafeteria line, a proper queue, with trays and serving stations, as though this were some civilian restaurant. As though these men were customers placing orders, not prisoners of war. Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. September. 1944. 200 German prisoners of war, most of them captured in France, in the bloody weeks following D-Day, arrived at this American internment camp. They were young men, soldiers, and they had been told, time and again, that Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of true sacrifice. Now, it seemed, they were about to witness the proof. His name was Hans, 22 years old, a corporal from Munich. He had fought for 2 years before the day he was captured. 2 years of mud and blood, and orders barked without question. In that time, he had eaten from Wehrmacht field kitchens, where officers were served first, and enlisted men received whatever scraps remained. Sometimes, there was nothing left at all. That was order. That was discipline. That was how the world was supposed to work. Now, Hans stood in a line, a metal tray in his hands, and he watched with growing disbelief as American soldiers, guards no less, served food to the prisoners, not to officers first, to everyone in order of arrival, first come, first served. A private received the same portion as a sergeant. No distinction, no hierarchy. Behind him, his friend Karl leaned close and whispered in German, "Look at this. No order, no structure. They serve prisoners the same food as their own soldiers. This is why they are weak." Hans nodded. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Around him, the other Germans were laughing too, quietly, mockingly. This cafeteria system, this strange American democracy that extended even into a prison camp, was all the proof they needed. Proof that America had no discipline, no backbone, no real strength. But they had no idea what was about to unfold. Because in roughly 20 minutes, Hans would walk back through that line. Not because he was ordered to, but because he wanted more. And that single, simple act would crack something open inside him, something he could never close again. Hans moved forward through the line. An American private, couldn't have been older than 19, stood behind the counter. The young soldier scooped mashed potatoes onto Hans's plate, added a piece of chicken, a serving of vegetables, a slice of bread. Then he paused. In halting, broken German, he asked, "Hungry? Want more chicken?" Hans stared at him. Was this a trick? In the Wehrmacht, you took what you were given. You said thank you. You never asked for more. To ask for more was greed. It was weakness. It marked you as undisciplined. "Nein," Hans said automatically. "No." The American shrugged and added another piece of chicken anyway. "You're skinny, man. Eat." Hans sat down with Karl and the others. They examined their plates like scientists analyzing foreign specimens, poking at the food, studying the portions. "They waste so much," one prisoner muttered, shaking his head. "Look at these servings," another added. "Decadent. Excessive." A third chimed in. "This is exactly why they will lose the war. No discipline, no sacrifice. They feed their prisoners like kings." But then they began to eat, and the laughter stopped. The chicken was seasoned, actually seasoned, with salt, with pepper, with care. The potatoes were creamy, rich with real butter folded in. The bread was fresh from the oven, still warm to the touch. Hans took a bite, and something stirred deep within him. A memory. His mother's kitchen, before the war. When food had tasted like this. When meals meant comfort, not just survival. He looked down at his plate, at the very food he had been mocking just moments ago, and realized something unexpected. He was still hungry. Not starving, just he wanted more. And more was available. Carl noticed Hans staring at the cafeteria line. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Have some pride." But Hans was already thinking about it. Then something unexpected happened. An older German prisoner, a sergeant named Otto, who had been at this camp for 3 months already, walked past their table carrying a second tray, a full tray. He wasn't sneaking. He wasn't hiding it. He simply walked back through the line, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Hans watched him pass. Did he just get seconds? A longer-term prisoner at a nearby table overheard and chuckled. "You're new here. Yeah, you can go back as many times as you want, until the food runs out. Americans are crazy like that." Carl shook his head firmly. "It's a trap. They're testing us, watching to see who lacks discipline. Don't fall for it." But Hans noticed that Otto wasn't the only one. Other German prisoners, men who had been at the camp longer, were casually returning for second helpings, and the American servers handed it over without hesitation. No judgment, no mark against their names, no punishment. Hans made a decision. He stood up. "Sit down," Carl hissed. "You're embarrassing us." Hans ignored him. He walked toward the line. His heart pounded as though he were marching into battle. The shame of wanting more. The shame of admitting the food was good. The shame of doing something so undisciplined, so openly human. Every step felt heavy with years of training telling him this was wrong. The same American private saw him approaching and smiled. "Back already? Good. What do you want?" Hans pointed at the chicken. Without a word, the private loaded up his plate, then added more potatoes, without even being asked. No judgment, no smirk, no trick, just food, freely given. Hans carried his tray back to the table in silence. Carl wouldn't look at him, but Hans didn't care anymore. He sat down, he ate, and this time the food tasted even better. Not because it was different, but because he was no longer fighting it. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't resisting. He was just hungry. The food was good, and more had been available. That was all. That night, in the barracks, the Germans who had gone back for seconds, and there were far more than Carl wanted to admit, didn't speak about it. But they thought about it. Hans lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the day's events turning over in his mind. Finally, he spoke aloud. "It's not about discipline." Carl, in the bunk above him, said nothing, but Hans continued anyway. "They have plenty, so they give plenty. That's not weakness. That's something else entirely." Over the following weeks, Hans watched the cafeteria system closely, and slowly he came to realize it wasn't chaos. It was simply a different kind of order. Everyone received the same portions. Everyone could have more if they wanted it. No one went hungry, while others grew fat. It was the exact opposite of everything he had been taught. But it worked. More than that, it did something to the prisoners. They began to relax, to remember that they were still human. Men who had been hardened by years of war started talking about their families during meals. They shared food with one another. They laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in years. Something in them, something that had been buried under orders and survival, began to surface again. By October, even Carl was going back for seconds. He didn't mention it. He didn't announce it. He simply did it quietly, without fanfare. Hans didn't say a word. He just nodded when he saw Carl standing in the line. One afternoon, Hans found himself standing next to an American guard in the cafeteria line, the same young private who had served him that very first day. Side by side, both reaching for food from the same place. Hans gathered his courage and asked in his limited English, "Why do you do this? Feed us, same as you." The American thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Because being hungry sucks, man. War is bad enough. Why make it worse?" Hans had no response to that. In the Wehrmacht, suffering had always been the point. It built character. It reinforced hierarchy. It separated the strong from the weak. But standing there in that cafeteria line, tray in hand, Hans allowed himself to consider something new. Maybe, he thought, there is a different way. In December, a new transport arrived at the camp. Fresh prisoners straight from the battlefields of Europe. They walked into the mess hall and laughed, just as Hans had laughed 3 months before. "Look at this American nonsense," they scoffed. "A cafeteria for prisoners. No discipline whatsoever." Hans didn't laugh with them. He simply ate his food in silence. And when he finished, he stood up and walked to the line for seconds, right in front of all of them. No shame, no hesitation, not anymore. One of the new prisoners stared at him, disbelief written across his face. But Hans didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't argue. Some things, he had learned, couldn't be taught with words. They had to be experienced. And in time, perhaps these men would understand, too.